Welcome everyone to the beginning of our final week with Beyond Jung, Living Synchronicity, chaired and curated by Professor Roderick Main. He holds a BA and MA in Classics from the University of Oxford and a PhD in Religious Studies from Lancaster University. He now works at the University of Essex, where he is a professor in the Department of Psychosocial and Psychoanalytical Studies and director for the Center of Myth Studies. Today's session is entitled An Arc of Synchronicities with Dr. Joe Cambray. And with that, I'll hand it over to Roderick.
Thank you very much, Michael, and welcome everybody. And it's my very great pleasure today to introduce Joe Cambray, who's I'm absolutely delighted has agreed to sort of be part of this series. Joe is a really major contributor to sort of contemporary thinking about synchronicity, and of him, it certainly can be said that his thinking is beyond Jung, in the sense that he one of his major contributions is to have sort of connected synchronicity to theories of emergence and complex adaptive systems, which perhaps will come into his presentation, and these are sort of ideas that, although they sort of originated in Jung's lifetime, in many aspects of them, couldn't really be developed fully until the development of sort of modern computing technologies and so on. So there are ways of thinking that have not fully been developed, and yet Joe has been applying these to synchronicity. And Joe is both a sort of an academic and a clinician, and on the academic side of things, he started off as a scientist, so he's got a sort of a very solid grounding in the hard sciences, and I think that's kind of important to bear in mind, because that's subsequently been complemented by a very sensitive hermeneutic ability cultivated as a Jungian analyst. You know, it's a very different way of thinking, and these two modes I think are sort of present together in a lot of what Joe does. So Joe's got many had many sort of leadership roles, I guess. He was the past president and chief executive officer of Pacifica Graduate Institute, and also he's a past president of the International Association of Analytical Psychology, the overarching body for Jungian analysts. He's been the US editor of the Journal of Analytical Psychology, and he was a faculty member at Harvard Medical School in the Department of Psychiatry at Massachusetts General Hospital, the Center for Psychoanalytic Studies, and has been a former president of the C.G. Jung Institute of Boston. So a tremendous amount of practical engagement on lots of different levels. So it'll be interesting to hear a little bit about how that may have sort of played in how synchronicity may have played into any of that. But in addition to all these sort of leadership roles, Joe has been very productive in writing, and his I suppose probably best known of his books is this one, The Synchronicity, Nature and Psyche in an Interconnected Universe, which was based on failed lectures that he gave, and so it was published in 2009, and really is tremendously illuminating book, going into a variety of areas, both the history of synchronicity, the sort of idea of interconnectedness, looking at emergence, and how synchronicities works in the analytic field in terms of empathy and so on. And my favorite of the chapters in the book actually is the final one on cultural synchronicities, where Joe sort of elaborates on how synchronicity can be seen not just in the sort of personal and intrapsychic and interpsychic level, but at the much larger cultural level. Really interesting stuff. He's also quite recently edited this book, Research and Analytical Psychology, one of a 2-volume series, of essays, sort of looking at research on analytical psychology, and also this previous book on analytical psychology, contemporary perspectives in Jungian analysis. There's also numerous articles out there in various journals and book chapters and so on many of them, probably the majority of them, engaging with synchronicity in some way. So it's worth sort of looking for those. And if we're lucky, one day maybe Joe will collect them into a handy volume for us.
Yeah.
And some of the areas that he's covered, not just sort of scientific thinking and emergence and so on, but ecology, disenchantment, Huayan Buddhism, death, holism, numerous topics. So I'm not sure which of those we're going to hear most about today, but I'm sure some of them will come into it. So with that, just I'll hand over to you, Joe, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to what you're going to be saying. So.
Oh, thanks so much, Roderick, for the invitation and for the collegial relations over all the years. I had a quick look at the people here. I recognize many friends and say hello to them and to new people that I haven't met yet. The talk today is a little unusual in the sense that part of this was to be a little more personal in our approach. And so I'm going to adhere to that. Let me just get up a slideshow here. Okay. So it's the arc of synchronicity across my life is really what I'm thinking of. And it has permeated as I get older and look backwards. It's sort of a punctuated equilibrium across the lifespan here. It starts, I've written some of this in different places, like Roderick has mentioned, but it starts really when I was about 8 years old, when I got a very unusual illness, a bit of a blood disease, and it created certain limitations for me, so that I couldn't do all of the sports that I might have played at the time. So in compensation, I began my analytic training. And what I mean is that I started to just spontaneously read world mythology. And the interesting part in the synchronistic pieces, as I was on a sort of project for about 3 years, as I completed the final readings of the mythic material that I had kind of put out for myself to look at, the illness spontaneously remitted. It just disappeared. The physicians had no idea what was happening. I now know more about it. I know there was a vitamin K deficiency and so forth, but I think the early introduction to the kind of links between the imagination and the body were what really struck me. And then in my scientific career, I had one or two of these rather peculiar things happen that it's part of how I got to Jung. I was living in Japan, and I was doing some research as a chemist, and I produced something of great interest, but I could only do it with one bottle of reagent, and we did everything we could to try to figure out what was magical about this particular bottle, why it produced crystals, and no other bottle could do that. We never solved it. But as a part of that, I began to look more deeply at my inner life. I got involved with Zen Buddhism in Kyoto, and this brought me to Jung in many ways. So it's a curious path. And then as I was finishing up my analytic training, I was really struggling with the conundrum of how I was going to marry the careers I had. That I had been a chemist, mostly theoretical chemistry, and now I was becoming an analyst. And while there was some areas of overlap and interest, most obviously in alchemy, it was still an open question. And what happened were some clinical issues. I began to work with several people who had some fairly severe trauma history. And I've published this, but the one that particularly struck me was the case I call the Black Forest. It was somebody who had a very severe early trauma history, and um, such that whenever we were working multiple times a week, and whenever there was a disruption in treatment, uh, this person would undergo some fairly severe breakdowns that required hospitalization and so forth. And finally, after working for a while, she asked if we could do something prophylactic instead of a hospitalization. And so I was open to this. And she asked for a phone call, which was a little unusual given that I was on vacation. But I made the call. And as soon as she picked up the phone, she said, "Are you in Germany?" And I was shocked I was not. I was in the Caribbean. And she said, I asked her why she was asking. She said, "Well, I had a dream last night. You were in the Black Forest and they couldn't find you." I thought, well, okay, so I had my own private associations to what that might mean in terms of the world of fairy tales and so forth, and the kind of anxieties that might be operating. And so we worked in a quite a productive way, in the sense of regrounding things in reality. And it turns out that this was the last time that the issues about hospitalization came up during break. So in that sense, it was a really major success. Um, where it became curious was the next day. I had begun to learn to do scuba diving. I was in the Turks and Caicos, off of the Florida coast, and I had a day or so of experience with working with the equipment and in the pool. And I came in that morning the next day, and the dive master said, "Why don't you come out on the dive this afternoon?" So, in fact, I said, "All right." And he said, "You got the technical stuff. Let's go." So this is my very first dive in open water, and we're about 45 minutes from the dock on the boat when the dive master calls us all around. He says, "Let me tell you about today's dive. It's called the Black Forest." And what that means is that there are black coral down between 30 and 60 feet below the water level. And it's exquisite. It was an absolutely fantastic dive, but I had a lot of pause, to say the least, in terms of the precognitive aspect of the dream from the patient the night before that seemed to have predicted this. And when I got back on the boat, I really had to think long and hard about what was happening between us, that there was a Black Forest as a third in which we were both, obviously having a very intense experience. For me, it was a numinous experience at multiple levels. And I realized that we were in the image of a Black Forest, but from different vertices. And so this caused me to go back and read Jung very carefully on synchronicity and trying to make sense of this. And what I quickly realized is that some of his arguments in the synchronicity essay, and go back to his psychic energy essay, and they're dated and problematic because he's talking about systems that are at equilibrium, and living systems are very far from equilibrium. So he's using 19th century thermodynamics in a way that doesn't work. And I felt, oh, how do I find a new approach to think about this from an energy point of view? Because that's what he was saying. You can't figure it out via energy because of energy conservation. And so the again, serendipitous good fortune at the time was the Santa Fe Institute was really up and running. Santa Fe, New Mexico, it was a group of Nobel laureates who were beginning to ask about interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary kind of questions that were really the most important for many scholars at that time, because problems within individual disciplines were fairly well defined, but it was really the areas in between that were problematic. And so you had to get out of your silo. And that led to the development of what Roderick mentioned, complexity. And when you look at complex systems, you look at the bottom here, you have systems, whether they be atoms or people, or molecules like water. local interactions in a system under pressure can produce what's called emergence, a global holistic structure. So in other words, water, if you looked at an individual molecule, would be expected to be a gas at room temperature. It's really the interactions between the molecules that holds them into a liquid form, essential for all life. And emergence, if there's anything archetypal, this is it's one of those things that truly has an archetypal base. You'll find it throughout nature from the micro level all the way through the largest macro level. For example, forming of stars is an emergent process. This ant bridge, ants do not have images of bridges in their mind, obviously, but it's a spontaneous interaction with their environment. And out of that interaction, they use the whole of their being to create something. Here you can see it's ephemeral. It lasts for a short while as they're able to make their way over the obstacles, and then it disappears. And so emergence can be either more permanent or more transitory. Here's a more permanent idea. Each one of the shells has the same fundamental pattern, but the way it expresses itself is emergent, and they're like our fingerprints. Each one is individual. And the question is, did Jung have this kind of conception in his thinking? And in fact, he was a proto systems thinker. It was being developed in the late 1920s by von Bertalanffy, but Jung didn't, to the best of my knowledge, read much then. He read something about cybernetics after the Second World War, and he began to use cybernetic thinking in his self-regulating psyche. But the idea of an emergent system is captured here in volume 13, that's Psychology and Alchemy, where you see he is using the self-regulating system. And he's saying that problems can never be solved, but only outgrown. And so it's looking for this higher level in clinical or developmental processes that he is specifying, and that is emergence. And I think you can make a strong argument that synchronicities like the Black Forest can be seen as a system under pressure, creating an emergent form, the Black Forest, and the individuals in it will experience it differently. But it's that the synchronicity is the way in which we each in our own separate ways experience part of the larger image, and then there's the connection between them. This is why later, I won't go into this today, but this is why I got interested in rhizomatic systems, where you've got an underground root system and you have individual plants that come up, and yet they're secretly below the surface, they're interconnected. It's another image that, and Jung himself was drawn to that. He talks about rhizomes and memory streams and reflections. Okay, a second clinical application. I'm with a client who's fairly well functioning, and we're talking about a short, again, disruption in treatment. That seems to be one of the kind of, at least triggers for some of these things. And we reach a point in our discussion where we have a pause, one of those moments where there's a moment of silence, and those are often very valuable to just let the psyche reset. And as I'm sitting there, I was very surprised because I suddenly remembered I had dreamt this image the night before. It was a spontaneous reverie that happened in the moment. And I want to link reveries and synchronicity in just a moment. So I knew this was an unusual thing. I hadn't been thinking about that, and I didn't immediately see what it had to do with the patient that I was in dialogue with at the moment. So I looked at him. The first thing was to do a sort of somatic read, and I saw that his eyes were a bit glazed. It had a kind of dissociative quality, just a light dissociation. And so I gently asked what was going on, and he looked a bit chagrined because he sort of was in a state of reverie. He was a bit dissociated. And I said, well, look, we were both just in this state of quietude and opening the mind. And so his embarrassment dropped, and he said, "Well, actually, I was out the window." The window? What do you mean? So he told me a story that for the years we'd been working, he'd never given me this detail. He was adopted, and on the day his adopted brother was brought home, he was left by himself for a couple of hours. And he wandered over to the next door neighbors, and when they weren't home, so he went in their backyard and was playing there, and they had a pool, but it was empty, and he fell in, and he hit his head and knocked himself unconscious. He it, about it, Within 2 3 minutes he woke up and he went home, and he never told anyone about this. And there are multiple levels of clinical meaning to this. I'm not going to go through all of that, but where the reverie, my reverie and dream became synchronistic, is when you study this particular class, these three birds, the black, white, and red birds. The commentary is that they have been in conflict and they have either killed or knocked themselves out. So you can see again the image of a blow that is knocking consciousness out was resonating at multiple levels throughout that particular moment. It was the kind of emergent field phenomena that, and this is the way I think of reverie, and the way I use reverie is to open one's mind to what's beginning to emerge in the field, in the interactive field. So with a bit of practice, you can find oftentimes in listening to dreams, there's something that's a bit askew or missing, and this will show up. If we have time, I'll give another story like that. But so here's another clinical application, and you see this comes with much less affective intensity than, say, the Black Forest. I mean, that was a shocker for me. And I began to realize that there may be a way of thinking about synchronicity in terms of frequency and intensity, that they might be inversely related to one another. There's something called a power law. The Richter scale is what most of us know about. That's what the most famous example of this, where you have a log plotted. I'm not going to do the math, but the very high intensity ones happen at very low frequency. So thankfully you only get a few nines on the Richter scale every couple of years. They're really pretty devastating. But there are lots and lots of 1, 2s, 3s, even 4s, especially out here in California. We see them all the time. And might synchronicities be very similar in terms of the frequency? I haven't had many with the kind of affective intensity that the Black Forest has had, but I've had a lot of these mild reveries that are linked to synchronistic events. And I think there is, again, a correlation there that can be explored. The value, at least from physics, is when that's true. It's called self-organizing criticality. When that's true, it means the same underlying phenomena is happening. And I think there may be something about a unified sense of emergence and synchronicity that might be there. So let's now go back to Jung and his story, because when I wrote the Fay lecture book, it was the lectures were given a year or so before the Red Book was out, and I just didn't have access to all of that material. Over the last 10, 15 years, I've learned a tremendous amount about what might have been going on for Jung. But some recent things that I've found really interesting were this is not in the Red Book, but it comes post Red Book. And this is from the Jung Family Foundation. They recently published a book called The Art of C.G. Jung. And in that book, there are some pictures that weren't in the Red Book. It turns out in 1919, Jung had a case of Spanish flu. And he was really quite ill. He thought he might even die. And as he was starting to recover, he had a number of dreams in which this blue sphere object began to appear. It's supposed to be a quadrated blue sphere. And in this image here, he found very meaningful and hopeful. There was a tropical island, like in the Canaries, and there were two trees on this rocky island, and the sphere floated and settled between the two trees. Another image, you can see the fever sense where he's, the sort of somatic body fever, and this probably a little bit, maybe a near-death experience, something where he's probably dissociating in the midst of the intensity of the fever, and he captures that again. And I began to wonder with COVID-19 whether we might be seeing something that we could begin to think of in terms of the psychoid. So it turns out this is what the Spanish flu virus looks like. There's been samples that have been saved, and you can do various kinds of microscopy on it, and looks familiar, doesn't it? I mean, here's a kind of comparison of COVID-19 and the Spanish flu. And very curious in this, you see these quadrated, they're triadic or quadrated elements on the sphere. And so I wondered whether Jung might have had an intuition of the infecting agent, even though he couldn't have known it, because the very first viruses to be visualized were the tobacco mosaic virus in the 1930s, and it's quite a different looking virus. It's not spheroidal like these HN viruses. And the one thing that made it into the Red Book was this, of course, this image over here. You'll see the two trees have come together now. It's a kind of an elaboration of what we saw in that fever dream. And that sphere has now become much more complex and rich. I would say, at this point, it looks like it's in a philosophical tree, and it looks like it is a form of the lumen naturae, the light in nature. It's in the dark, and it's giving forth a new kind of understanding or consciousness, at least. And the leap that I'll make is because I've gotten very interested, along with Roderick, in terms of re-enchantment, was looking at this and its development. I thought of the famous phrase that Jung had said in 1932 when he was doing his foreword for The Secret of the Golden Flower. He said, "The gods have become diseases." He was talking about the state of disenchantment in our world. That, and he gives a couple of examples, like Zeus as a power complex and so forth. And thinking of this image and that statement, I wondered whether this was a visual representation of Jung reversing that equation, inverting it, saying the gods have become diseases, so might we look to our diseases for the numinous? Might they carry a light in nature? So how might that be true for COVID? Well, I'll take the argument from the Chan Center at Harvard, where their best guess, the theories they've been putting together around the origins of COVID, are that it's due to global warming. And the argument is that as the planet heats up, animal species that are living in tropical, subtropical areas, it becomes too hot for them. So they begin to migrate out of those areas to try to find, living habitat. When they do that, it brings them and migrating birds and bats in contact with one another for the first time ever, historically. And of course, if you think about viruses, this is exactly what viruses love. They love to hop species in an opportunistic way when the host has no defenses. Those animals then get picked up, there are exchanges between those animals, and then they get picked up and taken to wet markets, and on we go to a pandemic. The upshot of all of that is that if that's accurate, if global warming has really driven the pandemic, then there's the way to think of this would be it's a kind of an interaction with the planet itself, with the kind of with nature, that nature is saying back to us, if you warm me, this is what will happen. Now, I don't think this is a conscious, deliberate effort. I'm not postulating it quite like that, but it is a natural response, and it's a systemic response to these kinds of things. And I think part of the message, if it's not taken in, is we will certainly have more of these to come, because as nature is going to reconfigure itself to deal with the warming that's there, you're going to expect all kinds of other changes, and so it does offer a chance for us to begin to look at larger kinds of consciousness. I think there's a whole question of the ecological dimension of the psyche that can start to be accessed through that. So just a moment on re-enchantment. Roderick's written some very nice things on this. This is Max Weber, the famous sociologist, who himself unfortunately died of Spanish flu. He died early. And he said the fate of our times is characterized by rationalization and intellectualization, and above all by the disenchantment of the world. He's really the one that coined that. This was in a lecture called Science as Vocation. And he was bemoaning this fact. I mean, he was a good Protestant, but he had a work ethic that drove him, as he said. But the question here of the loss of something about a vision of nature was really very poignant for him, and it's also in Jung. Jung talks about the despiritualization of the world. Roderick's book is a particularly valuable source for this, breaking the spell of disenchantment. And it's a wonderful look at the metaphysics behind that, including Roderick can say much more about this than me, about panentheism, and how we might use that in helpful ways. I'm going to look at it a little more from a clinical and cultural lens myself. I'll try to get to that near the end. So I want to go through now what the importance of synchronicity in Jungian thought. And that's only in the last few years really come clearer to me. It starts in 1927 when Jung has the famous Liverpool dream. And by the way, this is the Golden Flower. It's a year before he receives the book from Wilhelm, or the manuscript from Wilhelm. But in 27, has this dream where he's going around the city of Liverpool, and it's dark and dank, and sort of a wintry scene, and his companions are grumbling about this and can't imagine why anybody from Switzerland would live there. And in the midst of all of this, in the city, Jung sees an island on which there's this magnolia tree that's blossomed and it's shining forth. The flowers are shining forth its own light. And it's very clear when you read him on this that this came with a numinous sense, a realization of the self. And so it's one of the keystones of a kind of individuation model, this kind of realization of self. My question then is, with that powerful dream and with his understanding of it, as he writes about it, why didn't he stop there? In other words, he's gotten to something he's really looking, and he doesn't. He stays on for a while with the Red Book. And so that's where the exit from the Red Book becomes really meaningful, because I think it's saying individuation as a personal realization of the self is not adequate. This is what he paints to capture that feeling. This kind of diamond body-like thing is supposed to be the island with the glowing flower on it. It's really a year later, he's going to say that it comes in 1928 when Wilhelm sent me The Secret of the Golden Flower. And that's a very famous text that many of you will know. But I think there was, and that's, of course, very important, and we'll take a look at it. I want to go over, I left out a slide. I thought I had it in here. I have a slide. I'm sorry, it's not in this deck, where you look at the Vajra mandala from The Secret of the Golden Flower and the castle that Jung is doing his drawing at the time he received the manuscript. And he says at the bottom, he tells this story about receiving this manuscript from Wilhelm, who asked him to do a foreword or a commentary. He does both. And he's very struck by this. This becomes a synchronistic event of the first order for him. And in fact, in that year, in 1928, in November, after he's received this, he is running the dream seminars. And in the midst of the dream seminars, fairly early on, there's a dream where a ball shows up. And they do all of this amplification. Jung goes on for the whole session amplifying it. The next session, the patient who's had the ball dream has produced a bull's head with, or a cow's head with a ball or sun between the horns. And there just a number of people in the audience have encounters with bulls in that last week. They've started to report this, and they're flabbergasted and say, they ask you and they say, what do you think's going on? What's happening here? And his response is that, well, in the West, we think of terms of cause and effect, but in the East, they look at things that are synchronous, things that are happening at the same time. And the editors of that say this is the very first use of the term what comes to be synchronicity. That's in 1928. And you see, I think that Jung needed the synchronicity piece, not only to get himself out of the dilemma from his visionary state before the First World War. Am I going crazy? Am I a madman or am I a prophet? He needs to transcend that, and synchronicity is one of the tools that helps him do that. But it also completes the individuation narrative because it no longer is me as an individual alone. It's my relationship to the larger world that comes into real question. It's about the way the subjective and objective then become deeply interpenetrated. And I think that is one of the moves for re-enchantment. What I also wanted to say, I'm sorry, I should have put this one earlier. There was a kind of, I was watching Jung combine biology and psychology and mythology. In the Red Book, you have this image over here on your right of the page 125, this Atman Victu with holding this what I thought was a Swiss cross at first. And then I came across this image from Ernst Haeckel, the biologist, the sort of the German Darwin, and the parallels were just shockingly similar. And there's no way Jung could have not known about this because this image, along with 100 pages of folio called Kunstformen der Natur, art forms in nature, was in every household, and it was actually the one of the key documents for the German version of Art Nouveau, and so Jung was very, very interested in this sort of thing. So what you can see out of Jung's own experience in psychology, there's a kind of arc of development for the concept of first what feels like a personal vision to moving through some clinical experiences. At 27 is also when he had the case of the woman with the scarab beetle. That was a 1927 case as well. And so it kind of crescendos when he has this direct personal experience of the book with from Wilhelm. And I think, it takes him then from, that's 28. He meets Pauli in 32. In 30, Wilhelm, they do a memorial service. That's the very first time Jung uses the term synchronicity publicly. That's the announcement, but he doesn't say hardly anything. It isn't really until the late 40s when he does the Eranos lecture on synchronicity. And that's about 20 years later. And what's happened in the intervening time is, of course, the relationship with Pauli has evolved, and they have really worked on this. Susan Kieser was here a few weeks ago, and she's really done a marvelous job with that. If you read Adam and Archetype and then Susan Kieser's work, you really get a very clear picture of the evolution of the concept of synchronicity between the physicist and the psychologist. Okay, so now to bring it back a little bit more in personal direction, before my parents died, they asked my sister and myself that they said they wanted to be cremated and they wanted their ashes to be joined and then scattered at sea. So after they both died, we decided to respect their wishes, and we went to the city in which they began their romance and chartered a boat, and we went out into the harbor. And there were some specifically designed cruises for this, so we had a private charter. We went out there, found a place that seemed appropriate, played period music from their marriage, and um, we looked at photos, old family photos, and all of this. We kind of built a little bit of a ritual, and it sort of crescendoed where we to the music we scattered the ashes and we watched them swirl down. Well, as they swirled down, up from the depths came a mother whale and her calf, and they began to circumambulate the boat. They just swam around it. The captain was really he said, these are right whales. They don't come this time of year. This is very strange to see this. And he said, I've never seen them do anything like this. They stayed swimming around us for 45 minutes till finally the captain said, we've got to go back. So we said our goodbyes, and the whales were still swimming as we went back. It was a deeply moving, sort of surprising event. And again, at least for me, it was this connection to nature that seemed to be at the core of these kind of powerful synchronistic experiences. So let's move up in time a little bit to another story. This has to do with the four elements. I'm at Pacifica. I've been the provost there for about a year and a half, 2 years. The founder, President Steve Eisenstadt, has asked me to step in as president, and now he wants to retire. And so he asked if I would stand for president. And so the board did a search. I was selected, and they said, let's do a ritual. And so a group of us got together and thought about what kind of ritual. And I thought of alchemy, and I said, well, how about something on the four elements? Okay. So these are the four elements. The rhizomes, by the way, it's rhizome again. This goes back to Empedocles, or rhizome are the four, what we call elements. So we did a ceremony on that. This was in September of 2017. In early December of 2017, about 3 months later, the Thomas Fire broke out. It really endangered the entire Santa Barbara area. Unfortunately, the school was not hurt. This was followed at the beginning of January 5th, 6th, something like that, by these torrential rains that came, and the reservoir was unable to hold it, and there was a break in a pipe, so an additional 3 million gallons of water was dumped into the mountains above us, and it created these flash floods that came down the mountains, bringing all of this debris. It was called the Montecito debris flow. A number of people, sadly, were killed. And Pacifica, the upper campus, had to close for about 4 months because the debris flow had knocked out 5 bridges. Now, I was very pleased that neither campus had any physical damage from these events. And it turns out that the upper campus in particular, well, both campuses originally were connected with the Chumash, the local indigenous people here in the area, in the Santa Barbara area. And it was very clear to me that their understanding of the landscape, the school campuses were on what had been sacred sites, and I had really a deep new appreciation. But you can imagine, as the president of the school, these kind of disasters in the wake of a ritual on the four elements. I thought, what's next? And of course, what was next was the pandemic that showed up. So finally, in terms of synchronistic tales from the personal repertoire, it's my exit from Pacifica, my retirement in 2022. During the pandemic, the school was for months and months, and for actually a year and a half, closed because of the dangers of infection. And there were only a few of us on campus who came there regularly. In particular, where I was, the general counsel and I were sometimes the only two on campus, and we would work together, and we'd spend a lot of time. So we developed a really close friendship. And he was roughly my age, and um, we started to plan a number of retirement activities. He decided to retire the year before me, and we kept up a very close friendship during that year that he'd retired. We'd regularly get to lunch, and we were planning, like I said, all of these activities. When suddenly he died, it was really very tragic. He got an illness, and within 3 days he was gone. And I was very grieved by this. This had been a very close relationship, and it had been part of my own thought and planning. And so when it came to the retirement party, about 9 months after he had died, I was very sad and thinking about him. It was somebody I wished had been there. Well, then the night before, I had, for the very first time, a dream about him. Uh, really out of nowhere, he'd shown up, and we were having a very nice conversation until I, unfortunately, said, "But aren't you dead?" Uh, you know, and then he got up and he left. Um, and there's something about that kind of egoic naming of these things that I suspect is part of the problem. But where the story gets interesting is at the retirement party. So I'm given a number of nice little gifts, and clearly from the board they have thought about this, and they have a bowl. They have a crystalline bowl, like for fruit and so forth. A really lovely, lovely bowl. So they give it to me in a gift box. They ask me to unpack it then and there, so I do. Hold it up. I hold it up. They say, "Please read it." I read it, and the name is of the general counsel. It's not my name, and they're totally embarrassed and sort of distressed. How could this have happened? And I had some idea how it might have happened, but I said, "But I think it's very meaningful, at least to me." And I did mention my dream from the night before, the way in which this friend had appeared, and it was who I was hoping for at this party. And so, in some way, having the bowl engraved with his name had a very apt quality for me. It was very welcome in a way. And again, Jung mentions that synchronicities are often to occur when there's something archetypal that's constellated, and certainly with this professional career in academia, that's kind of what I saw operating there. So let me say a few little more words about reenchantment, because this is where all of this is leading me. How do we think about synchronicity and its potential? I mean, I believe it's valence neutral. I can give you some negative synchronicities where difficult things have happened. Same with emergence. It's not all happy, light, and fun, but I think its meaningfulness does create a sense of wonder. Wonder is a very key term here for reenchantment in my mind. Wonder in the sense of joy. Wonder opens things up. So I found myself thinking about looking towards the arts for the sense of reenchantment, and where might I look? Well, there's a statement from Jung: art intuitively comprehends coming changes in the collective unconscious, which makes complete sense. I mean, that's part of the role of the artist, is to lead us in a way into the future through visual imagery. And by the way, I think, without getting into the debate about whether the work of the Red Book is in quote art, because Jung was conflicted about that. I think one thing that we could look at and go in more deeply is Jung as a visual thinker. That sometimes his writing is rather convoluted in terms of the way he uses language. It's a deliberate attempt at some kind of complexity narrative. Deirdre Bair touches on that in her biography. But I think more to look at how he's able to think visually and represent psychological transformation within visual metaphor is very valuable. And I think that's part of what I can see in terms of the work in the Red Book that he's looking for that. But let's come now into the 21st century and a movement in the art world that's particularly interesting for me. And this year is a banner year. It's about surrealism. 1924 was the year in which André Breton wrote the first Surrealist manifesto, and that's being celebrated around the world. All kinds of major exhibitions of surrealistic art have happened and are happening over the last couple of years in honor of that. And the Surrealist interest in the unconscious, the manifestations of the unconscious, was an attempt to try to see how that was happening at a cultural level. Well, in 2022, as you see here, the Venice Biennale did their whole theme on the milk of dreams. And that term, the milk of dreams, comes from one of the surrealists, Lenora Carrington. It comes from a book of rather bizarre tales that she wrote for her two sons, surrealist fairy tales, if you will. And she, looking at this, she was at the center of a group in Mexico City. And I'm going to look at her and Remedios Varo as two examples. These women at starting just before the Second World War, but really after the Second World War in the late 40s and early 50s, get interested strongly in Freud and Jung. They start to study alchemy, they study Gurdjieff, and they're trying to represent in art form something that they see moving, something I would say we're probably beginning to feel more fully. And I think this 100th anniversary is really a part of that narrative. So let's look at a few things. Here's one of Carrington again. This one is a painting called "And Then We Saw the Daughter of the Minotaur." It's from 1953. And this is a self-representation with her two sons. That's the figures at the front part of the dream. She's deliberately put on a red robe in honor of the notion of the rubedo. That's a conscious move on her part. And you see the way in which the interior world and the exterior world are beginning to be interpenetrated. The spirit and matter are engaged. And this was a deep part of what was being sought for, not the kind of raging bull of the Minotaur of classical mythology, but something about another kind of mindset. So this was one thing that's picked up. Here's another from the Guggenheim collection in 2022, where surrealism and magic, the enchanted world again, are beginning to be manifest and being shown. To go to Remedios Varo, who I'm particularly interested in at the moment. This is at the Art Institute of Chicago a year ago. It was here. They did a group of paintings of hers called Science Fictions. And this is just the cover of the catalog. The actual photo, the actual painting is here. And what you can see is this kind of gender neutral flute player is using music in a way to bring into reality something that is only in a kind of sketch form or outline form. It's being constructed with these stones with the fossils in them. So there's deep embedded sense of history to build this tower through magical musical means. It's a kind of and it's an attempt to mix science and this whole surrealistic approach. One I particularly like is called The Fabric of Space-Time. I'll just mention briefly, this is supposed to be a 17th century couple, and there are all these, it's in the fabric of space and time as if everything is there. It's a kind of a Sheckic record kind of model. And it has a personal resonance for me because I had a dream at one point just before I began to switch careers where I had an experience that looks a bit like this, where I was able to step out of a room and see a tapestry and realize that each of the nodal points where the knots crossed was another life that could be entered. And that's really what Barrows is beginning to give us, a cosmological vision. In other writings, I've talked about synchronicity as a cosmogonic narrative. Jung actually says at one point that for synchronicity, space and time collapse to essentially zero in synchronistic events. Well, he's writing that in the late 40s, just as the Big Bang theories are being articulated in astrophysics. And it's very key, because I think what he's trying to do is to say synchronicity, especially if you think of it as a tendency to form patterns, um, that's in there even before the laws of physics have themselves been um, delineated, before they come into existence. And there is some truth to that, I think, in a deeper way. So this cosmogonic vision that can be accessed through the synchronistic proposal is really important. A reenchantment from Varro is this one called Solar Music. Again, the similar kind of androgynous figure playing light beams, bringing life to the forest floor. And you'll see that the several birds here are becoming colored. There's this sense of reanimation of nature. And I think that's a very key element in this question for us is, what does this mean? Here's another one where she talks about alchemy as the useless science or the alchemist. And you see, look at the way the woman's cloak becomes the floor, that the external reality and the experience of the self are intermingled in these kinds of visions. And she very much was reading Jung at the time that she painted this. One or two more of hers, and then I'll come to a stop with her. This is another one called Harmony. Again, you see this figure is beginning to work with mathematics and music and being assisted by these kind of inner beings that are beginning to manifest in this very surreal sort of way. And there's a lot more to be said about these, but I think you can begin to get the feeling of a kind of harmony between one's psychic world and the external world, something we're not at yet. I would say we're moving towards. And here's the creation of the birds, where you see a kind of alchemical apparatus separating out these fundamental colors, while the creatrix is bringing in light from the stars, astral light, using the heart, the music of the heart, to create new life and seeing it animate. So the themes of reanimation are very powerful here. Here's another one, embroidering the Earth's mantle. I'm sorry, and here's one, the call, again, the link between the outer world and the inner world, and the kind of animation that's there. And just for kicks, this her still life, nature, still life resurrected. Somebody gave it a little bit more animation on the internet, so I particularly like that one. But what about reanimation? What about reenchantment? As Roderick mentions in his book, and I fully endorse, you've got three levels: enchantment, disenchantment, and reenchantment. Um, they're not a linear sequence. They coexist. They're like layers that are there. And so, as much as we may idealize certain things in the past and wish we could go back to some kinds of enchantment, that's not possible. We've been stuck in disenchantment, really starting at the late 16th, early 17th century. We've been moving more and more in that direction. That's really what Weber was talking about. And now in the 21st century, and with complexity thinking, we're beginning to find the need to bring in the subjective and really even the numinous back into our felt lived experience. And that's the challenge of reenchantment here. The art, I think, hints at it, points to it. It gives us a kind of way of imaging it for ourselves. But how will we do this? This is why I think something like the COVID pandemic is something that's genuinely challenging us in a way to say you need a larger holistic view. You must start to think about the way the entire system of the world operates and become in harmony with that, or you're going to create more of this for yourself. So re-enchantment has got a very practical thing. It isn't simply a kind of um, looking to magic of the past and trying to cultivate numinous experience. It's really understanding that more. And so, and this is something I'd be interested in discussing with you. I've touched on reverie a little bit, and I'm wondering more and more about the idea of the use of reverie in nature or including nature in our reveries as a part of the way we begin to really have a deeper dialogue with the natural world. That it would be a form of re-enchantment. That would be whether you can call it active imagination in a certain way, but one where your active imagination is not solely with your dream life. It's beginning to be with the world that we experience. The anima mundi would be another way to look at that. And I think this is something you can pursue, but you can't predict. So I'll bring my formal talk to a conclusion with the picture that was on the cover of my book. I was very taken. This came from a group of mathematicians, and the story here of this glowing limit was that they were studying. You can probably see different spheres in there. They were studying the close packing of spheres. If you have a space and you want to put a bunch of spheres together, what's the best way to get the most in there? And so they were running some computer programs that were designed to help them answer that question. And they were shocked that this gossamer web, the yellow web, spontaneously appeared. They had no idea that that was going to show up. This was an emergent property in their mathematical calculation. And one of the people who was working on the calculation and the imagery said, "Oh my goodness, it's a vision of Indra's net." Indra's net, of course, comes from Buddhism. It's the story the Buddha tells about the interconnectedness of all beings, that he talks about Indra's net as covering the entire cosmos. And it's a net where at each intersection, there's a drop, like a drop of water, that reflects every other drop. And so that when you look at one drop, you are connected to all the other drops in the universe. And it's a kind of metaphoric model. By the way, there are things in the West that we had as well. Leibniz had a hall of mirrors that used a very similar kind of thing. But I'm saying it's iconic for emergence. It's iconic for the kind of new way of approaching things that may bring us towards re-enchantment. I think we're still very much in the process of exploring that. I think synchronicity can be a tool on the way. I don't know that it's the full answer, but it's part of the narrative. I think that's certainly true. So that's pretty much, well, let me before I end, add one more thing. And that is, I do a lot of work online like this. I've been doing that increasingly. And of course, with the pandemic, it's made this a daily thing. And over the years, I've gathered up a lot of narrative about electronic failure happening at particularly charged moments in analytic encounters. I'll tell one story and then I'll stop. And this is a story. I was running a supervision group in another country, actually in China. And we were being shown a series of slides and giving the progression of the case. And I noticed there was something out of order. And so I let it go for a minute, and then it just kept, there was something for me in it. So I asked the presenter, I said, "Can you tell me what happened there?" And as soon as I said that, that person's screen went blank. They dropped out. It turns out there were 70, 80 people on this call. Nobody else had any problems, but this person's equipment failed. It failed in such a way that they had to totally reboot. They came back online, And it was wonderful because this was an experienced clinician and said, that was really interesting. That you picked up that I left out a slide. I left it out because it showed a regression in the case. It showed the person was moving backwards. You know, they were reverting to an old pattern, and it broke the beauty of this sense of development that they were wanting. And so it gave us an opportunity to talk about regression in the service of the self. That in fact, that regression was to pick something up that that patient needed and this therapist needed. And once that was in hand, then the forward flow could be reinvigorated. It is a kind of almost re-enchantment. And that was done through reverie. And I won't go on and just keep telling stories, but I think you get a feeling for the kind of way in which reveries often can occur in a kind of nonlinear synchronistic quality to the field. It's not cause and effect. I mean, you know, it's just paying attention. It's using one's curiosity to notice disturbances in oneself and just exploring the curiosity, not knowing. I mean, I certainly didn't know what I was looking for when I asked. It's more that serendipitous finding what you're not looking for by accident. So with that, I think that at least hopefully gives you a bit of my personal journey in this. I mean, sometimes I feel trapped in synchronicity. I can't seem to get out of it. I keep writing about it over and over. So thank you. Thanks, Dennis.
Okay. Thank you so much, Joe. That was really, really fantastic, and so many sort of topics covered, so many sort of dimensions of the phenomenon, as it were. And I particularly like that that you managed to sort of weave in both your sort of scientific background and also, you know, this art at the end, you know, which is really nice. I mean, just a little sort of synchronicity-ette, shall we say? There's currently an exhibition of Leonora Carrington in Colchester at the where I live and in the local gallery. So, but anyway, and your focus on the important metaphorical aspect of synchronicity reminded me, actually, as you were speaking, of one of my favorite lines from your, or phrases from your book, where you refer to synchronicity as an objective metaphorizing tendency of the world itself.
Yes.
You know, that in a sense the world is doing poetry, or the world is doing metaphor, as it were, and this is and we're reading it, you know, so we're almost, in a way, we're sort of back in almost in a kind of a modern version of the signature of things.
Indeed,
very,
indeed.
very interesting. Yeah, so I suppose whilst people are sort of thinking of questions to ask, and just to say that the way to do that would be to use the reaction button at the bottom of the screen. Anybody who wants to ask a question, if you go to the reaction button, press on it, and then press the raise hand function. There's lots of other functions you can press there, but if you don't want balloons to float in front of you, or sort of poppers or whatever, you go for the raised hand. But meanwhile, whilst people are thinking of their questions, can I just ask you a little bit more about what you were thinking in relation to reverie in nature, and how how you envisage this sort of working, or what you actually mean by that?
Yeah. More recently, when I've been, sort of traveling and giving lectures and workshops, I've started to move into the question of wonder. And one way to do it is to, do a little bit like an active imagination, enter a mild, light altered state, and then go back to earliest memories. I do a trajectory through the lifespan for people of first experiences of wonder. Where were they? What was going on, to really enter into that? And so you begin. It's very curious in terms of the kinds of things many of the experiences are nature-based experiences with water, with plants. Something's happened there, that somebody's been at a grandparent's farm or what have you. So I began to appreciate this kind of sense where wonder and nature were intertwined. And then I started to think about and do some exercises where one thinks about an issue in nature or question one has, or takes even a photo of nature, something in nature, and just opens up and let watch the reveries that come up. So in preparation for doing one of these workshops, I practiced on it myself. I was in a hotel room. I was unfamiliar, and it had these. It had some pictures from the desert, and I just sort of opened the mind, as it were, to what the image might be saying. And I suddenly heard an internal voice, where are the pollinators? And this whole question of, the loss of sources of pollination, the birds, the bees, the decrease in these populations. So that I think it's there in the field. It's how to enter into an interactive field with the natural world. And that, for me, would be one of the steps that I see towards reenchantment, based on the work that really comes out of Beyond, the psychoanalyst Beyond, and then people like Tom Ogden and Antonino Ferro, where they're looking at reverie in the interactive field and picking this stuff up that is not, and when you read their literature, these are basically synchronicities they're describing. Ferro has a case where he's going on a bit too much in a session, and the next session the woman calls and says, I can't make it. The river has flooded and I can't get through. And he immediately starts to understand that this is true at the level of physical reality out there. I mean, there was a flood that was happening, and that it's a metaphor for what happened in this last session, that she couldn't get to him because he was flooding her with all of his stuff. And to see that kind of thinking begin to enter, where you get this permeability between our deep internal states and events in the world. And that's, for me, a very synchronistic set of occurrences. So those are some of the ways I'm thinking about this.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. And I was also very struck by, I think right at the beginning, you said something about how you got interested in mythology, and that and that interest in mythology just sort of mysteriously seemed to help with the sort of alleviation of whatever it was you were suffering from. And so are you sort of kind of implying, I suppose, that this kind of reverie, even though it's not going to have much bite or purchase in a disenchanted sort of nuts and bolts scientific world, nevertheless can have a sort of salubrious cultural effect just by those of us who are, sort of pulled in this direction to engage in it. It just somehow some collective cultural process or something is activated and helped, something along these lines.
Yeah, and I think complexifying narrative, making our story richer and better has a kind of palliative effect. And what illnesses don't have at least some psychosomatic component? I mean, when I get sick, I believe in infectious agents. I'm not ruling those out at all. And I will go to the doctor and I will get appropriate medications. But I also want to look at exactly when and why these things occur, because the timing of them feels to me highly relevant. And so oftentimes reverie around what was going on there can open up the psychosomatic concurrence that's there. I don't think it protects us against illness, but it may at least alert us.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, we have some questions.
We do.
Quite a few.
And yes, we have a number of questions. And Sonia, would you like to come in and unmute yourself, and I will add you to the spotlight?
Yes. So hello, thank you so much. I mean, it was such a wonderful wander around the synchronicities you shared. I think I'm sure everyone would agree that we are very grateful. And I attended Professor Main's talk also, where he shared personal synchronicities. I find there's a healing dimension to hearing those stories. And I always feel sad that we don't talk more about this kind of experiences. And the second aspect was that those synchronicities were describing how you transcended opposites, with regard to your profession and what you were living, but also the poetry of what you experience, or the words in general, because I couldn't help thinking about global warming as a global warning when you were speaking. And influenza, grippe in French means grip,
Yes.
influenza, influence, fever, all these refer to a hotter atmosphere. It makes me feel a little bit more optimistic, because I'm so heartbroken with what happens, especially in the East, Middle East, proxies from the West. And so my question is, don't you think it would be so beneficial if there were, I've never heard about that, and I've sometimes mentioned it in Dreams group I was participating in, where we had many collective synchronicities actually through our dreams and beyond. Why are there not such things as synchronicity sharing groups, or things where communications would then become a vector, the same way as we speak with our analyst, for example, and maybe we would uncover collective messages and ways to unite and do something about the state of the world, for example. Thank you.
Yeah, it's I know there've been some attempts. I haven't tried to do it because of my schedule, but there have been some people that have tried to put apps and so forth together that collect this up. I know Bernie Beitman, who Roderick and I know, he runs a coincidence sort of workshop on a regular basis. But I think you're touching also on an issue that I would like to, if I could devote more time, would be this cultural dimension to this, cultural and global. That there's something about a lot of these synchronicities that are not just personal. I think that's why it was so important for Jung to get to synchronicity, is that he began to realize what he could say, oh, I'm a prophet, I saw this vision of Europe filling up with blood, was to miss the point that it was something in the collective. And that the synchronistic dimension of that really does point to a larger aspect of it. So the question is, how do we develop a form for this? I mean, that's part of the challenge to do collective work around synchronicities. One of the stories I particularly like about group wisdom, it's not quite synchronicity, although it's darn close. The U.S. Navy had lost a submarine at the end of the Second World War off the Atlantic coast of the U.S., and they couldn't find it. They've been looking for years, and they convened a group of experts to try to find this thing, with no luck. The marine biologists, the ecologists, and so forth, they're getting input. And finally, somebody on the team said, let's do a weighted average. They did that. They kind of, who's likely to have a little more knowledge of where this might be. They were within 100 yards of the submarine. They found it. In other words, the knowledge was in the room, but it didn't belong to anybody. You had to work with the whole collective. Otherwise, you couldn't get there. And so I think that's something about putting our synchronicities together. Some people have done dream matrices at conferences and so forth in the early morning, and they sometimes take on this quality for a conference. So I think there's much more to be explored in terms of the way we could amplify and enhance or magnify some of these things. But exactly how, that's going to take some thought. So it's a great question. Thank you, Sonia.
Great. Thank you so much, Sonia. Thank you, Joseph. And if we could move on to Max.
Okay.
Max, if you would unmute yourself. You're going to need to unmute yourself, actually. You're still muted.
There,
Perfect.
am I?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, yes. Sometimes I touch my phone and things that I didn't want to happen. I guess that's, so thank you very much. This is wonderful to hear you share yourself in this way. And so I'm interested in your thoughts, just largely, I started the Pari Center with the Beyond Jung you know, in the
Oh.
quantum realm, it's about probabilities.
Sure.
You know, last session, I think that someone who was talking got into astrology and asked Roderick about it. He said, I don't know much about that, but I'm open to divination. I'm into the I Ching. You know, I have been involved with Chumash people for half my lifetime, you know, particularly the ones who got the songs and ceremonies, and, you know, that stayed underground for so long. And there's a Wishtoyo Foundation. I'd love to connect you up with them. I've been on the board for, you know, but anyway, one of the things they have is a game where using what could be considered coins. They're actually acorn tops, or what. Anyway, you know, you throw them and you're trying to get like a multiple of, you know, 3 or whatever, and but the game is that you're playing, and the person that's throwing, you know, with the I Ching, of course, you're meditating, but you sing a song. And when you feel that you've reached that moment where your ego is gone, you know, you throw them. And so there's a lot of enjoyment around that, but it's also just, you know, getting where is that place that the, you know, as you said, it's not either or, enchanted or disenchanted, or, you know, re-enchanted. And I don't have a specific question. I want to put that out and see what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I'm very interested in the whole question of divination. I actually wrote a paper or 2 on that, looking at the altered states of consciousness that the diviner gets into. I was looking, for example, at the Pythia in ancient Greece, and the kind of it's very curious. At the end of the 19th, early 20th century, they dismissed the fact that there might be any gases that would have created an altered state. Then at the beginning of the 21st century, sure enough, they found some. And it seems to be a kind of parallel to what's happening in culture. And the idea there is, in those altered states, that, using the language of William James, might they have noetic qualities? That there's something, certain states of mind have access to knowledge that it's different than egoic knowledge. You know, the ego's knowledge tends to be sharp, focused, rational, cognitive, and that's got much value. I mean, I use it all the time. But these other states that you're talking about, you know, knowing when the song has reached that moment, that kairos of that moment, to let go. It seems to me there's a wisdom in that that's more holistic. It's more diffuse, but the diviner, a good diviner, is really open to that and can feel the kind of, you know, subtle variations in whatever that current is that creates the moment that this is where to open to whatever that knowledge is. So yeah, I love it. I mean, I'm interested in this interface.
Great. Thanks so much, Max. Thank you, Joseph. Does that answer your kind of question, Max?
Yes, no, that's wonderful. I just say I'll try to connect up after next time.
Yeah,
I'm in
please
San
do that.
Francisco these days, but I would love to connect you up with the Wishtoyo. Is that Chumash? You know, they came over from the islands on a rainbow bridge, Wishtoyo, and for others just to complete it, we're sharing here. You got, but it's kind of like the story of Lot in a way, or how the song lines in Australia in many ways. But so they were told not to look down, and some of the stragglers did look down, and the rainbow disappeared, and they fell in the ocean, and the others pleaded with the Creator they weren't bad people, and she said okay. And when they came up, they were the dolphins. So it's about that relationship, you know. So anyway,
great
ways of thinking, you know, that bring things together.
Yeah,
thanks so much,
Max. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Joseph removes. So Charles, if you'd like to jump in and unmute yourself, ask your question.
First of all, Joseph, thank you for a very, very fine talk this morning, from my morning anyway. In Jung and Pauli's original formulation of synchronicity, the onus mundus notion plays a very prominent role, and Harold Ottmanspacher reformulated that as dual aspect monism. I wonder what role that plays in your emergence model.
Yeah, Yeah, Harold and I are friends. So yeah, I worked with him. I wrote a little paper for him on Spinoza. Because Spinoza was really talking beyond dual aspect monism, it was a multi-aspect monism. But I was interested in why both Jung and Pauli never really referenced Spinoza. So I wrestled with that. I don't know that I have a complete answer, but I certainly think there was something about the way Spinoza was mistreated and as a heretic and so forth that caused Jung to shy away from that because he was very anxious about similar kinds of things. So the question then, when I look at these emergence models, yeah, I come very close to a dual aspect monism. That's very close. I mean, the question of what kind of emergence, there are multiple possibilities of weak and strong emergence and so forth, but that fundamental model of a unified background out of which things emerge, and as they emerge, they take on differentiation is fundamental to what I think is going on with synchronicity. That black forest thing. What is the black forest? That's the way it images in the mind of the two human participants, but it's something from a deep background field, and I think that is where so many of these disciplines can really come together and allow that. That's probably, as you know, part of re-enchantment because it isn't the model that fits the scientific kind of perspective from the outside. It really is, something that goes back to
sort of on
a
related theme there. Can you give me your understanding at present of what the term psychoid means?
Yeah, I've been wrestling a lot with that. I'm very interested. Jung coined that in the 40s, and there is some bias in the way he presents it. He favors he used the UV-IR dichotomy that we have consciousness, and above consciousness is the ultraviolet. That the metaphor for the spiritual world beyond the human psychic world, and below is the somatic world going down into material reality. And when you read him on that, he puts the psychoid up in the upper portion, and he acknowledges that there's an infrared lower portion, but it is somewhat split. And I think that needs to be looked at again because I think there's a kind of subtle prejudice. And it's losing the kind of potential equalities. I think I'm interested in a related way, the psychoid imagination. And what I mean by that is you can look throughout history. That's why I gave the example of Jung with the sphere and that matching the morphology of the virus. But you can go to, say, the 13th, 14th century Iran and look at some of the temples there, and you'll see these kinds of tiling patterns that do what's called Penrose tiling. You probably know what that is. It only is symmetric at infinity. And one of the questions that people have asked there is, how in the heck did these people, with the kind of tools they had, envision this kind of thing? It's like an aspect of reality that's beyond the culture, and it requires a leap of imagination that I think actually touches into something deep in reality. The other one that comes to mind is Van Gogh, the Starry Night. If you get in front of the original, it doesn't show up in reproduction, but if you're in front of the original, it twinkles. And there was a group of physicists who went there and studied it and said, my God, he's captured the essence of turbulence. How the hell did he do that? We can't describe it, but he's actually managed to create the effect of turbulence, that kind of shimmering twinkling. And so again, for me, there's some reaching into the nature of reality, into the fundamental natures of what I would call the psychoid layer, and being able to bring that up. Jung didn't seem to think that was possible. He thought it was unrepresentable, but I'm arguing that I think we can see evidence of individuals, gifted individuals, including Jung himself, who had some ability to surface that material, even if they didn't recognize what it was. So it's the area I'm working in. I don't have a final definitive statement on this.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Charles, and thank you again, Joseph.
Mhm.
Yes, Abelardo, if you would jump in with your question.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Cambray. It was a wonderful talk, and there are many things that you said, and particularly now also in the discussion that relate to, really ring a bell to me. I think that particularly the point you're making about the importance of us in contemporary problems that we're facing, to be able to really connect. And for example, they're saying that about 70% of the whole global populations are now aware of climate change. And we're in the midst of this political process where there's so much negation going on as well, and manipulation of other people's minds for political reasons on this. So these are very crucial matters, I think, that you're talking about. And my basic question has to do with the relationship between telepathy and other forms of mental communication. And you were talking about how the emergence of conferences, for example, is a scenario. I want to share an example, perhaps the most difficult answer or question for me in terms of synchronicity took place in 1987. I had been involved for 7 years in Central America. I'm in Costa Rica. I'm Costa Rican. Involved with the Quakers in the Peace Center. We were trying to work to counter the wars going on in Central America in 3 countries. And in 87, the Esquipulas Peace Accords came, which was the beginning of political settlement of all those conflicts. But I had been hearing the Dalai Lama speaking about universal responsibility for some years, and I thought to myself, this is probably the heart of the problem we're having in the world and in Central America in that context, because we are in a human rights dominating culture. And we need to, and everybody tends to think about their own egoistic rights usually. And, you know, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there's only one article on human duties to one another. We should be brothers to one another. That's the only reference, solidarity. So it's a fundamental mental shift. Now, somebody gave me the idea. Somebody who had just returned from India to be with the Dalai Lama for 3 years. He said, invite the Dalai Lama, get the University for Peace, the United Nations University for Peace, to invite the Dalai Lama to Costa Rica to talk about the Buddhist approach to inner peace, to peace in general. And so I got the idea, and I went, and they said, yes, we're not going to give you a dime, but and then I got in contact with the Tibetan office in New York, and they said, yes, it's feasible. But you need a letter from the president of Costa Rica, because he's never, they want to make this sort of like a state visit. He's never been to Latin America. So I got the letter, and then 3 months later, he said yes. And then I was with, you know, well, how am I going to finance him and his entourage from India to Costa Rica? Anyway, somebody came, you know, in the picture, and the whole process evolved. It took 2 years, and it had morphed into a global conference of 700 people called Seeking the True Meaning of Peace. We also had Thomas Berry at that conference. Okay, so brilliant minds came together, and I asked the Dalai Lama, you know, how did this happen? Because ever since you accepted the invitation, all kinds of synchronistic events started taking place. You have the mental power to influence over from India to here, Costa Rica. He chuckled. He said, no, there's a karmic connection between Tibet and Costa Rica. There are lands of ahimsa. And he said, there's a karmic connection between you and me. so I didn't know what to make of all of that, but these are dimensions of what my question, and it's similar to your Black Forest example. I was really inspired by that. Was there a telepathic connection of some kind, or did he tap into a meaningful symbol or archetype that connected to your mind? Or so there's all kinds of important questions.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, you're raising an extremely valuable and interesting idea. Jung talked about synchronicities as being unconscious to unconscious communications. I certainly wasn't consciously aware until the shocking moment. And by the way, when something's emerging out of the unconscious, the sense of surprise or shock is often the affect that we experience at a conscious level and an egoic level. But I think it's a larger holistic field that we're really looking at in terms of these kinds of things. It isn't me, it isn't the patient. The feeling of telepathy that's there is because we've entered a common field, that we're in that same field. Again, I particularly like the work on mycorrhizal networks. There are a number of people. Peter Wohlenleben wrote the book The Hidden Life of Forests, but really it's the work of Suzanne Simard that's very key in this. And she's the one who found these interconnections between the trees of the forest. And they're the largest organisms on the planet, and they have amazing capacities, including to weather certain amounts of climate change. And so the metaphor and the reality it's almost post metaphor. You need something more about this interconnection, because there's something. It's not quite physical. It's not quite tangible. I don't know exactly the word to use here, but there is something real about the state of interconnectedness, and I think that is what the Dalai Lama is putting his finger on. That's the net of Indra. That there's a basic level of reality in which that kind of interconnection, that's the Jonas Mundus question, goes to this point as well. That at that level, when you touch into that, the feeling of connectedness really does transcend these differences. It does bring us, and in some way, I would suggest maybe the Dalai Lama, were more open to this. That I think it's there all the time, but the question is, how do we, in some deep way, access it? How do we open ourselves up to it? That's why I'm interested in exercises with wonder and things like that, because I think they allow us to get out of our kind of conscious mind and enter into these more altered states that do have knowledge to them, including this kind of communicative potential. But we need a whole nosology of states of consciousness, that really help us understand the different forms and how you access. I mean, there are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of different kinds of consciousness, and each one can have subtly different properties. So the telepathic dimension that you're touching into is a kind of way of knowing, in my mind. And what are the ways that we can access those aspects of our mind? Certainly, synchronicity is a kind of post fact knowing. I mean, it's like, wow, that's something we don't know quite what it was, but we now have evidence that something happened, and that's what you're saying. And it feels to me like, the Dalai Lama's got enough humility that he doesn't take ownership of, I created this. No, I just am someone who can be in touch with it and be open to it. So,
great. Thanks so much, Joseph, and Abelardo. Thank you for your question.
Can I make
we can cycle back to you with another question at the end, but we have a few people in the queue right now. So,
I'll try to keep
Joy,
shorter.
Joy, if you would like to jump in with your question, and I'll add you to the spotlight.
I'm trying to lower my hand.
Okay, you're all set.
Okay. Well, hi there, Joe. This is when I was at Pacifica, for some reason this mute thing is showing. I don't know how to.
You're fine. Yeah, I can hear you, no problem.
I remember this just brought back some, because I was thinking, is this Joe? Is this the same?
Yeah, it's the same one.
In the depth program, and we had a meeting, we set it up, we had this big meeting, and because I was complaining about Lionel Corbett, because writing his book during class and using us students like kind of like a involuntary focus group, and I got kind of pissed off about it. And
I remember.
So
Yeah.
played
Okay.
about, but anyway, so but I think one reason that came back to me is because just all of what you've written and all of this and all the things you're doing at the same time, it boggles my mind. It's like, how do you do this? And then I was thinking, well, that's how Lionel did it. But anyway, and then it just brought back so many things like the reverie and Baccalaureate and all that.
Nice.
Yeah.
Oh,
It's
nice to remember.
And then of course just that horrible devastation in the Montecito area. Very
painful.
sad. People died from that. It was awful. But anyway, I think if I had the means and the time or whatever, I would just do a program all over again. Just it was so great. So I don't really have a question, and this is I think it's just because I'm flooded with questions. I don't even know where to begin. So I have to kind of do my own sort of reverie to kind of sort out what's on my mind. But I really appreciate your presentation, and it's just nice to see you. So thank you.
Thanks, Joy. Yeah, nice to share a few memories.
Beautiful. Thank you, Joy, for sharing. And if Raymond would like to jump in.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk and striking images, which one could spend a lot of time interrogating and thinking about. One of them I wanted to bring up and have a question about. In the image of the Red Cross from Jung's Red Book 125, it seems that there's an individual, if I have it right, sitting on a bench above the clouds and having an experience with or contact with what I would interpret as rising above into some kind of cosmic or archetypal realm. Yet this figure, and I'm thinking presumably Jung himself, this figure is alone up there having that experience. Could synchronicity be some kind of an occurrence where, imagine two individuals are having that rising experience simultaneously, encountering something in the archetypal realm, as you mentioned, the Black Forest. So the two of you going up, and the Black Forest is constellated in the archetypal or cosmic realm or conscious, the unconscious, however you want to term it. And so I think of three circles, that large red cross above, and then two smaller ones representing the individuals. Instead of the normal communication between people horizontally from one consciousness to another, the synchronicity actually goes up into the cosmic. You kind of go up, across, and back down again. And it's the cosmic is the mediation between the two. And it was interesting, you said that Jung, at the moment he got the secret of the golden flower, he kind of breaks out of the Red Book visions. That was interesting to me because the secret of the golden flower was something that personally I read every day for 25 years before and after I did my daily meditation twice a day. And it made a big impression on me. And could it be that when Jung gets the secret of the golden flower, that's that other relationship through a work of art to another consciousness that validates for him, I'm not a madman, but somebody else has thought about this too.
And he had that Liverpool dream with the magnolia tree, which it was a golden flower a year before. And so suddenly now he's doing this manuscript. There are multiple levels to the synchronicity, is the way I understand it. The shape of the mandala in the front of the manuscript matches closely to his mandala, and he's already got this charge of a golden flower as a realization of the self, and it all comes together. And I think Wilhelm was a key figure in that there was something shared, because Wilhelm had been working with this Taoist teacher in Qingdao in China, putting this all together. And it was really this concatenation of all of these things simultaneously. Feels to me like we find ourselves inside of these things, that they are larger than us. They supervene over us. That's an old term for emergence. And we find ourselves partaking in it. And that's why I like to think about it. Oh, from my individual perspective, I see this, the other person sees this. But, it's the Indian tale about the elephant, the wise men each having a different part. Yeah, okay. It's still one elephant. And that's what I think you're really getting at. I agree with you. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great.
Yeah, thanks, Ren.
Joe,
Thanks
can
so much.
Can I ask another question, Joe? You've elaborated really quite brilliantly the sort of relation or the connections between synchronicity and emergence, complex adaptive systems, and so on. Do you find that there are what is it that synchronicity, in a sense, distinctively adds? I mean, if somebody were doing cultural analysis or using complex adaptive systems as their kind of framework for understanding several cultural phenomena, or any phenomena really, what do you think synchronicity distinctively adds, to that? I mean, do we need synchronicity if we've got thinking in terms of complexity and complex adaptive systems? What's it bringing that's distinctive? And are people who are engaged in that you've encountered, who are engaged in thinking with complex adaptive systems and emergence, are they sort of open and receptive to the idea of synchronicity? Have you found?
Yeah, it's easier to start with the second part. If people have a strong background in complexity science, when I frame it this way, there is a sense of recognition. Yeah, this does work within, because I can give you some other biological examples that are close, and so there are ways to build bridges. I think what it adds, though, and when I've shown up in China, where the thought process is a little more systemic, there are lots and lots of their doctorates are in complex sciences. They pick this up right away. It's just more inherent in the culture. But the question of what it adds, I think there's, well, from a sociological perspective, the sociology of an unconscious is not well articulated, and this would be a key component in that sociology, that most people don't look at this layer of things. I think the cultural piece is another one that's really very important to look at. And the thing I like about that is the way in which, if you go to a rhizomatic model, the synchronicity can live over many lifetimes. That these things are not, they create a ripple and they keep going. Even take the Black Forest case. I worked on that, and 20 some years later, I'm reading Suzanne Simard, and I'm kind of working on this rhizomatic structure of forests. And I suddenly dawns on me, I'm in the Black Forest again. I mean, I hadn't put that together until one day I suddenly, oh my God, there I am. That synchronistic thing is shaped, and it has a kind of endurance that goes on. And I see that when I started to look at synchronicities in culture, the way, there's a whole thing about Cortez and Moctezuma that I write about. I think that's particularly important, that we're finding ourselves only now in this century to begin to slowly work our way out of that. The consequences of those synchronicities that were really problematic. The way a divination system was usurped in a synchronistic way and then used for political domination. I mean, there's a whole narrative that's in there that can be found. So you can reread political theory as well, if you can begin to allow the possibility of seeing how these are there and what people how they've employed them. Unfortunately, I think a lot of times in history, it's not so happy. Although the good one was, and I've been thinking a lot about it, as people said about politics, is, the formation of Athenian democracy was very much out of a kind of complex adaptive system model. They were losing the war to Sparta, and Cleisthenes got them to reorganize and rearrange themselves in an emergent fashion, and that produced some incredible innovations that allowed them to avert disaster and then enter a golden age. So, but I think those are only the tip of the iceberg. Yeah.
We do have a couple of new people in the queue for questions. If we still have Evie, you're back. If you jump in, I will spotlight you.
Am I here?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. I'm an educator, and I'm in attention and order and the role of attention in our process of individuation. And attention moves. It's not just egoic, or sometimes our attention is in our unconscious, and symbols can find us, or we can find them through our art. I'm also so the question is the role of an intention in our whole process of individuation, which then includes society, because we see that we are one with all. So the question really, in the word attention, the root being tension, there needs to be a tension between and among creators. There's a tension, there's intention, extension, attention, and then there's an interlying wave of meaning, purpose, that come into this process. How can we use that to benefit that cultural that energy of culture to aid humanity to come to awareness? Did that make sense?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about the question of attention, that you're raising, because these reverie states they tend to be embarrassing for most of us, because suddenly you're wandering someplace, but that wandering of attention, which could look like ADD, you can pathologize it. And we so easily pathologize that state that we miss its capacity to bring in other kinds of information. That's kind of this noetic quality yet again. And I think there's a question of disciplining oneself to use reverie in a disciplined way. That is, you allow the mind to wander, you allow this inattention, some movement, and then you pay attention to the affect. And when something has been contacted, then you come back and reflect on it. I think there's a whole cyclical process there. And that's where you can begin to harness some of the energy. At least that's the feeling I'm moving towards. So that's a quick answer, but to be explored.
We need to talk about it. It would be beneficial. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for feel like you plugged me in again.
Oh, good.
I'm rebooting.
Great. Thanks so much, Evie. And thank you, Joseph.
Good.
Joseph, we've got someone new, Mark. Do you have a question? Do you have time for like one last quick question then?
Yeah, sure.
All right, Mark, if you'd like to jump in, I'll spotlight you. And
thank you. And thanks for your talk. My question, you've touched on it already, Joseph, so thank you. It's about there seems to be an explosion of narcissism in society at the moment, and it's been sort of supercharged by social media and by the rise of multi-billionaires and the power they have. And I'm just wondering about narcissism and inflation. And synchronicity is a very powerful tool when it's used in the correct way. You said about it having also this mutual balance, I think you said. So there's there can be a dark side to it possibly.
That's right.
And we've seen how, for example, the Catholic Church and some Buddhist sects have misused mythologies, and they've got involved in child abuse, and they've used their power to
sure.
nefarious purposes. So I just want you to maybe, and Roderick as well, because we are in a kind of we have a short window in terms of climate change and the political crises we're going through. I think Rick Tarnas mentioned it about how we use some of these tools to help us to accelerate a raising of consciousness. So just could you maybe respond to that, please? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the dangers of narcissistic usurpation of these kinds of things, trying to claim it. And, some people will do it in a carnivalesque kind of way to spotlight themselves in that. And we've seen that in the political arena. This most recent assassination attempt really disturbed me in such a profound way. I could just see historical parallels going on in that, and the way in which it's what people do to respond. I mean, this is why I think Jung's own experience is so important, because he doesn't take the bait of a narcissistic self-aggrandizing, which would be to say, I'm a prophet, I know the way. That's an incredibly dangerous thing when we give over to people that power, because they've taken a synchronicity and used it publicly to kind of highlight themselves. I think, well, that's what Hitler did. I mean, he was very good at that kind of thing. So absolutely being conscious of that shadow and watching the way in which people use synchronicities. For me, it's an ethics issue. You've got to have a sense of your own ethic and hold to that if you don't ethically reflect on this, then you're going to get lost in it. And I think it's the danger of being possessed by an archetype. Because once you open that door, the shaman or whatever it is that holds that kind of archetypal pattern is very close. And it's not been a happy thing in human history when people get possessed by that, if they're in positions of power. So conscious warning for others to pay attention, to make this clear that synchronicity is a phenomenon, not a personal skill or trait. I think it's that the piece that you're saying about manipulating that where I feel disturbed. But
Great.
I wish I had more of a solution.
Thanks so much, Mark.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And we're winding things up. So Roderick and Joseph, you've been so incredibly generous all the way around. But Roderick, Joseph, if you have any final closing remarks, that would be fantastic.
Well, I'd just like to thank Joe very much for absolutely superb talk and a really sort of insightful and engaged responses to the questions that were received. So thank you so much for that. And I'd just like to say, how much, whenever I hear you speak, and today was absolutely no exception, I feel deeply heartened about the possibilities for sort of exploring the cultural significance of synchronicity. Not just as a sort of as a sideline, but as something that really is integral to what to knowledge, to the sort of cutting edge of modern knowledge processes, and so on, and how the more scientific modes of thinking and the more sort of imaginative modes of thinking can be synthesized and can both be deployed to sort of address in a very serious way, and as you say, a very ethical way, some of the many sort of really kind of challenging problems that are sort of besetting us in contemporary times. So yeah, it's been great listening to you, and thank you very much for everything you said tonight, or this morning for you, of course. At this time, I should say.
This moment tonight.
Space-time relativization, always around when
sure
you're talking
is.
with synchronicity.
Yeah, it sure is. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
It's another thing we're psychically getting used to is being in multiple frames simultaneously. This is not part of our evolution at all. We are not designed from our senses to do these multiple things simultaneously, but And indeed, thank you for the opportunity. You know, there's always something about the energy of the group that's also part of the talk. I feel that is always essential. And you know, I was able to hear one or two of the other talks, so I came in with a feeling about the group. So I want to thank everyone for their attention, for their wonderful questions, for their reflections, and for you most of all for hosting all of this together with Eleanor. I really appreciate that. So I hope to see some of you in various kinds of ways.
Great. Thank you both
Okay.
so much.
Thank you.
And very brief announcement. We conclude our series tomorrow with 4 shillings and 6 pence, Synchronicity and Poetry with Richard Berngardt. So thank you all for showing up. Thank you to our hosts. Thank you for Joseph for sharing his knowledge, and thank you for all for participating. The questions and the presence add so much. So we look forward to seeing you all tomorrow or very soon at the Party Center. So have a good evening or morning or wherever you may be.
Thanks again. Okay, bye-bye, everyone.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks again.